Imagine being locked in a room with someone who thrives only when you bend, break, and bleed. Now imagine discovering that the very trait they underestimate in you, the depth of your empathy, is the exact sword that pierces their armor. Narcissists wear a mask of superiority, but beneath it hides a fragile, starving self that fears exposure more than death itself. They survive by draining others, projecting their wounds, and manipulating with charm. To most, this seems invincible. But a super empath is not most people. The super empath sees through the mask. They understand projection. They recognize the shadow for what it is. And here lies the quiet torture. By refusing to react, the empath denies the narcissist their favorite fuel. Silence becomes a mirror that forces the narcissist to face their own emptiness. By holding boundaries with compassion, the empath exposes the hollowness of manipulation. Nothing enrages a narcissist more than a kindness they cannot corrupt. By shining steady light, the empath reveals the shadows the narcissist tries to bury. Every smile that is not controlled, every act of self-love the empath displays is a reminder to the narcissist of what they will never have without change. This is not cruelty, this is alchemy. The empath does not torture with fists or fire, but with something far more unbearable to the narcissist: clarity. Every human being carries within them a side of the self that rarely sees the light of day. It is not the polished persona we present to the world, not the smile for neighbors, not the competence displayed at work, not even the gentle voice offered to loved ones. Beneath that mask exists something older, rawer, and far less comfortable to confront. The shadow. This shadow is not merely a container of malice or cruelty. It is a vast reservoir of repressed impulses, forgotten fears, and denied desires. It is the storehouse of everything we have been taught not to be, yet still are in some hidden way. From childhood, society begins to sculpt us into acceptable shapes. Parents scold, teachers correct, peers mock, and the culture whispers or shouts its standards of what is allowed and what must be suppressed. The child who feels rage may be told that anger is ugly and must be swallowed. The child who longs for attention may be told they are selfish and must be silent. The child who dreams of freedom may be told they are irresponsible and must learn to conform. Each rejected impulse does not vanish. It slips underground into the unconscious, forming the architecture of the shadow. But repression is never destruction. What is hidden still breathes, still grows, and still influences our choices in ways we often fail to notice. The man who prides himself on being gentle may discover sudden bursts of cruelty when threatened. The woman who claims indifference to status may secretly resent the success of others and sabotage her own relationships. The leader who preaches integrity may be caught in the grip of scandals they cannot explain. The shadow does not disappear simply because we ignore it. It waits, patient and unrelenting, demanding expression through dreams, slips of the tongue, irrational reactions, and projections onto others. The danger of the shadow lies in its denial. The more we insist that we are only good, only moral, only kind, only rational, the more violently the shadow pushes for recognition. It leaks out in distorted forms, like poison gas escaping through cracks in the wall. Someone who insists on their honesty may become obsessed with catching liars in others. Someone who denies their vulnerability may attack the weak with merciless precision. Someone who suppresses their own sexuality may become consumed with policing or shaming the desires of strangers. The energy of the shadow, unacknowledged, always finds a way to surface, but never in the form we consciously choose. And here lies the paradox: the shadow is not inherently evil. It is not a demon living inside us, waiting to corrupt our souls. It is, instead, a set of energies, instincts, and potentials that have been exiled from the conscious mind. Within the shadow lies not only aggression, envy, and fear, but also creativity, erotic vitality, intuition, and untapped strength. The child who was told to stay quiet may have buried their capacity for bold leadership. The one told to abandon fantasy may have hidden a gift for art or innovation. The shadow is a dance partner, not an enemy, but one we often refuse to recognize. To dance with the shadow requires courage. It demands that we stand face to face with the impulses we have been taught to despise, the thoughts that embarrass us, the feelings that terrify us. It is easier to project them outward, to accuse others of the very traits we cannot admit in ourselves. The gossiper despises those who gossip. The arrogant man condemns arrogance in others. The fearful soul mocks cowardice wherever it appears. Projection is the most common disguise of the shadow, allowing us to remain blind to our own inner contradictions while waging war against them in the external world. Yet every act of projection strengthens the shadow's grip, for we are fighting ourselves without ever realizing it. The deeper truth is that integration, not denial, is the path to wholeness. When one admits to their envy, they can use it as a compass pointing toward what they truly desire to achieve. When one acknowledges their anger, they can channel it into courage and protection rather than destruction. When one embraces their fear, they can cultivate humility and awareness. Integration does not mean indulgence. It does not mean letting the shadow control us. It means inviting it into awareness, giving it a voice, and recognizing that it belongs to the totality of who we are. This process is neither comfortable nor quick. It is often accompanied by shame, resistance, and confusion. The ego does not like to admit that it is incomplete. Yet without this work, people remain fragmented, forever trapped in the cycle of repression and projection. Their relationships suffer because they demand from others what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. Their ambitions falter because they are sabotaged by unconscious forces pulling in the opposite direction. Their inner lives remain restless, haunted by dreams and impulses they do not understand. Those who choose to engage with their shadow discover that the dance is both dangerous and liberating. Dangerous because the shadow, once unleashed, can overwhelm if not handled with care. Liberating because within its depths lies a profound authenticity. No longer does the individual need to wear endless masks or maintain exhausting pretenses. They learn that to be human is to be complex, contradictory, and unfinished. They learn that the darkness within does not erase the light, but gives it contrast and meaning. In myths and stories across cultures, the hero's journey is never complete without a descent into the underworld, a confrontation with monsters, or a battle with the dragon in the cave. These tales are metaphors for the shadow. The monster is not some foreign invader. It is the unacknowledged part of the hero's own being. To slay or befriend it is to reclaim lost power, to bring back treasure from the depths, to emerge more whole than before. The shadow dance is the same journey played out in the psyche of every human being, whether they know it or not. From the moment we first step into the world, we begin to learn the rules of belonging. A baby's cry earns comfort, a smile wins affection, And soon the child understands that certain gestures invite approval while others trigger rejection. This is the beginning of the mask, a subtle adjustment of behavior to secure safety, care, and love. As years pass, the mask becomes more elaborate. In school, it is the mask of competence to please teachers, the mask of toughness to impress peers, the mask of obedience to avoid punishment. Each mask is a social tool, and like any tool, it has value. Without it, human society would collapse into chaos, for masks allow us to meet in common ground and interact without unleashing every raw impulse that stirs inside. The mask, or persona, is not inherently false. It is a necessary compromise between the individual and the collective. At work, the mask of professionalism allows colleagues to collaborate without descending into personal conflicts. In friendships, the mask of humor can bridge awkward silences or soothe tensions. Even in intimate relationships, masks serve a role, allowing one to hold back harsh words or disguise fears in order to protect another's feelings. To live without any mask at all would be unbearable, for it would expose the raw, unfiltered psyche to the judgment of the world, and few could endure such nakedness. Yet, problems arise when the mask ceases to be a flexible garment and hardens into a permanent skin. When the persona becomes the entire identity, the individual forgets the difference between performance and essence. A person who has worn the mask of competence for decades may forget what it feels like to admit confusion or vulnerability. The one who has relied on the mask of charm may become terrified of silence, unable to exist without constant admiration. The dutiful mask of obedience may choke the very spark of creativity or rebellion that once defined the soul. Slowly, life begins to feel hollow, as though one is playing a role in a theater without ever stepping off stage. This hollowness is not always visible to others. On the surface, the masked individual may appear successful, respected, or even admired. Their social mask functions smoothly, earning promotions, friendships, or public praise. But inside, a quiet dissonance grows. The inner voice, muffled by years of pretense, begins to whisper, "Is this really me?" That whisper, if ignored, becomes a restless ache, a sense of emptiness that no external achievement can fill. The tragedy of the mask lies not in its social necessity, but in its colonization of the authentic self. Masks are seductive because they protect us from rejection. The more deeply one fears abandonment, the more tightly the mask clings. Consider the child who learned early that love was conditional, dependent on good grades, obedience, or charm. That child grows into an adult who believes that authenticity is dangerous, that only the mask can secure affection. Each relationship becomes a performance, each encounter a stage, and in time, the actor forgets there was ever a self beneath the costume. Projection plays a powerful role here. When people mistake their mask for their true identity, they begin to judge others who fail to wear theirs properly. The businessman who hides behind professionalism may despise colleagues who show emotion. The person who masks vulnerability with arrogance may ridicule those who admit weakness. The performer who relies on beauty or charisma may attack those who age naturally, seeing in them the fate they most fear. In this way, the mask not only imprisons the wearer, but also spreads judgment outward, reinforcing the belief that authenticity must be punished. Yet the human psyche resists being flattened into a single performance. Dreams often reveal the neglected parts of the self, those that do not fit within the persona. Nightmares may present the dreamer with embarrassing figures, grotesque figures, or irrational scenes that undermine the polished surface of waking life. These images are messages from the deeper self, reminders that the mask is not the whole story. Likewise, sudden breakdowns, midlife crises, or unexplained depressions often signal the revolt of the authentic self against decades of repression. What appears as psychological suffering is sometimes the protest of a soul smothered by its own costume. The cost of living entirely within a mask is not only personal but relational. Intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability cannot pass through a rigid persona. A person who hides constantly behind charm, strength, or authority may attract companions, but rarely experience true connection. Partners may feel as though they are relating to a surface, not a depth. Friends may sense a barrier that cannot be crossed. Children may inherit the same patterns, learning that authenticity is unsafe. Thus, the mask that once protected from loneliness paradoxically creates it, walling off the self from the very closeness it seeks. To examine the mask requires courage, for it involves the possibility of rejection. If one removes the mask of competence, will others still value them? If one takes off the mask of obedience, will love remain? If one dares to shed the mask of charm, will silence be met with acceptance or abandonment? These are not abstract questions, but real terrors woven into the nervous system by years of conditioning. The risk of taking off the mask feels like the risk of annihilation, which is why many cling to their personas even as their inner lives wither. Still, those who dare to question their masks often find that the feared rejection is less devastating than imagined. Some relationships may fall away, but others deepen. Some opportunities may close, but new ones arise. More importantly, the hollow ache begins to soften as the inner voice is welcomed back into consciousness. Life regains texture, color, and unpredictability, qualities absent when every gesture is scripted by persona. The mask, instead of dissolving, returns to its rightful place as a tool, worn when needed, set aside when not. Human beings rarely see reality as it is. Instead, they filter experience through a web of memories, expectations, and unconscious assumptions. Among the most powerful of these distortions is projection, the act of disowning parts of the self and locating them in others. Projection is not merely a trick of perception. It is a defense mechanism, a strategy the psyche uses to keep intolerable truths hidden from awareness. The qualities we cannot bear to recognize in ourselves, our anger, greed, envy, weakness, but also our brilliance, creativity, and strength, are banished from conscious identity and encountered as if they belong solely to other people. In ordinary life, projection often appears in subtle ways. A person who insists they are never angry may constantly complain that others are aggressive. Someone who represses their competitiveness may accuse friends of being power hungry. The individual who denies their own dishonesty may become obsessed with exposing liars around them. These projections act like mirrors, showing us what we cannot or will not admit about ourselves. Yet, because the mirror is externalized, we believe we are dealing with the flaws of others rather than our own unfinished business. Projection can also take a more seductive form. Just as we project what we despise, we also project what we admire but do not dare to claim. The timid soul who has buried their assertiveness may idolize the charismatic leader. The person who doubts their intelligence may worship the scholar. The one who has disowned their sensuality may become entranced by artists or lovers who embody it without shame. In these cases, Projection creates figures of fascination and longing, people who seem larger than life because they carry the qualities we have exiled from ourselves. We fall in love, we follow gurus, we deify celebrities, not realizing that the light we see in them is also buried within us. This dual movement of attack and idolization reveals the depth of projection's influence. When someone irritates us beyond reason, when we feel an outsized hatred or contempt, it is worth asking whether they are carrying something we secretly reject in ourselves. When we place another on a pedestal, when we feel worshipful admiration that borders on blindness, it is worth asking whether we are seeing our own potential reflected back at us. In both cases, the other becomes a screen for our disowned qualities, and until we reclaim them, we remain captive to the distortions of projection. Relationships are especially fertile ground for projection. Lovers often begin in the glow of idealization, each seeing in the other the missing piece of their own psyche. One may project nurturance, the other strength, and together they believe they have found completion. But as time passes, the shadow side of projection emerges. The very qualities once adored may become sources of irritation or resentment. The nurturing partner feels smothered, the strong one feels controlled, and each accuses the other of faults that originated in their own unconscious. What began as enchantment dissolves into conflict, not because the other has changed so much, but because the projections have shifted, exposing the underlying reality. In social and political life, projection operates on a grand scale. Groups and nations project their collective shadows onto outsiders, labeling them as dangerous, immoral, or inferior. Entire populations are scapegoated because they carry the disowned fears and desires of the majority. Wars, persecutions, and ideological crusades often have their roots in mass projection, where a society seeks to purge itself of its shadow by attacking it in others. The fervor of these movements reveals the intensity of unconscious energy driving them. People fight with such passion not only because they believe in the cause, but because they are battling parts of themselves they cannot face directly. Art and mythology have long captured the drama of projection. The hero who confronts a dragon is often facing not an external beast, but the inner forces of fear and aggression. The villain in a story frequently embodies traits the culture condemns, while the hero reflects the qualities it secretly admires. Audiences resonate with these tales because they mirror the psychological truth that much of what we encounter in the outer world is shaped by what we deny or exalt within. The stage, the page, and the screen become arenas where projections can be explored safely, even if unconsciously. The danger of projection lies in its power to blind us. When we are caught in projection, we believe absolutely in the reality of our judgments. The cruel boss truly seems like a monster. The glamorous star truly seems superhuman. We cannot imagine that what we see so vividly outside is, in part, a reflection of what exists inside. This blindness creates suffering, for it keeps us divided from our own wholeness. We disown anger until it erupts uncontrollably. We deny vulnerability until it cripples intimacy. We suppress creativity until life feels dull and mechanical. Each rejected quality seeks expression, and projection provides it, but always in distorted, externalized form. Yet projection, for all its distortions, also offers a path towards self-knowledge. By paying attention to the intensity of our reactions, we can trace them back to their hidden source. The people who provoke us most may be carrying a lesson about our own shadow. The people who enchant us most may be holding up a mirror to our buried gifts. If we dare to withdraw these projections, to reclaim what we have cast outward, we begin the work of integration. This does not mean excusing others' faults or denying their virtues, but recognizing that what we see in them is inseparably linked to what lies within ourselves. Awareness is the light that makes visible the contours of the inner and outer world. It does not change reality itself, but it changes everything about how reality is experienced. In the absence of awareness, a person lies trapped in a fog, reacting automatically, pulled by emotions they cannot name, driven by impulses they do not understand. To live without awareness is to be ruled by illusion, to mistake shadows for substance, masks for truth, and fleeting impressions for absolute reality. The one who awakens awareness begins to pierce this fog, and in doing so gains a form of mastery, not over others, but over the very forces that once held them captive. To see both light and shadow is the essence of this mastery. Most people prefer to look only at the light within themselves, the virtues they cultivate, the talents they show, the kindness they extend. They construct an identity from this partial vision, declaring themselves honest, generous, strong, or rational. But beneath this conscious self lies the shadow, the neglected reservoir of contradictions, fears, and impulses that do not fit the chosen self-image. Denying this shadow creates fragility. The person who insists they are never cruel becomes vulnerable to cruelty expressed unconsciously. The one who insists on perpetual rationality becomes blind to their irrational drives. To see only the light is to remain half blind. On the other hand, to see only the shadow is equally distorting. Those who dwell obsessively on their flaws, who fixate on guilt, shame, or failure, lose sight of their own radiance. They become convinced that they are nothing more than their wounds or their darkness, and this identification imprisons them just as much as denial does. To be consumed by the shadow is to collapse under its weight, unable to recognize the creative, loving, or resilient aspects of the self that also exist. Awareness is not about choosing one side over the other, but about holding both in vision at once. The power of awareness arises from this balance. The individual who can look squarely at their generosity and their selfishness, their courage and their cowardice, their brilliance and their ignorance, no longer needs to hide from themselves. This transparency weakens the grip of illusion. Manipulators lose their power when their tactics are seen clearly. Internal conflicts lose their sting when both sides are acknowledged. Emotional storms lose their capacity to overwhelm when one can name them as they arise. Awareness is not control in the sense of domination, it is control in the sense of freedom from unconscious enslavement. In daily life, this awareness manifests as a quiet steadiness. When insulted, the unaware person reacts instantly, consumed by anger or humiliation. The aware person feels the same sting but notices it, recognizes the shadow it awakens, and chooses a response rather than being hijacked by reaction. When praised, the unaware person becomes inflated, believing themselves larger than they are, clinging to the projection of greatness placed upon them. The aware person accepts the praise, but also sees the shadow of vanity lurking beneath, and so remains grounded. This equilibrium creates a kind of mastery, not in dominating others, but in no longer being dominated by illusions, whether those illusions come from within or from without. In relationships, the power of awareness becomes even more apparent. Many conflicts between partners, friends, or colleagues arise not from reality itself, but from projections and misunderstandings. One sees selfishness where there is simply fear, or betrayal where there is simple difference. Without awareness, these distortions escalate into battles. But with awareness, one begins to notice the hidden dynamics at play, the projection of insecurity, the repetition of old wounds, the shadow speaking through anger. This recognition does not magically solve every problem, but it allows for choices that are not available when blinded by illusion. Instead of escalating, one can inquire. Instead of condemning, one can reflect. The one who sees both light and a shadow in themselves is also less likely to be deceived by the masks of others. They recognize charm as charm, not as proof of sincerity. They notice when strength is genuine and when it is a disguise for weakness. They are less likely to idolize, less likely to demonize, and more likely to see the complexity in every person. This does not mean they become cynical. It means they become discerning. Awareness sharpens perception so that illusions, whether flattering or frightening, no longer dictate the response. Historically, leaders, teachers, and healers who cultivated deep awareness often carried an aura of presence that others could sense. This presence came not from mystical power, but from the refusal to be blinded. They saw through the falsehoods of their own egos, and thus could see through the illusions presented by others. Their mastery was not domination, but clarity, and clarity itself carries authority. People feel drawn to those who see clearly, for in their company, the fog of confusion seems to lift, if only for a moment. Awareness, however, is not a static achievement. It is not a trophy to be won and then displayed. It is a continuous act, a vigilant turning of attention toward both the luminous and the shadowy, toward both the inner and the outer. The illusions of the psyche are relentless, always seeking new disguises, always tempting the individual to fall back into blindness. To cultivate awareness is to engage in a lifelong practice of observation, reflection, and integration. It requires humility because even the most aware person remains vulnerable to self-deception. It requires courage because looking into the shadow is often painful. And it requires patience because clarity unfolds gradually with setbacks and moments of darkness along the way. The mastery that emerges from awareness is subtle but profound. It is the mastery of not being so easily deceived by appearances, of not being thrown into turmoil by every emotional wave, of not mistaking projections for reality. It is the mastery of choice, the capacity to act rather than merely react, to discern rather than blindly judge, to acknowledge both the brilliance and the brokenness within oneself without collapsing into either extreme. Would you like me to expand the final keynote? Individuation. True strength comes from integrating empathy with boundaries, not dissolving into another's chaos, next in the same 800-word style, or would you prefer a more narrative-driven approach with examples of real life dynamics? Every human being begins life enmeshed in the needs, emotions, and expectations of others. A child learns to survive by tuning into the moods of parents, sensing danger in a raised voice, or seeking comfort in a tender smile. This sensitivity is essential for growth, yet it can also blur the line between self and other. Many adults continue to carry this pattern into their relationships, believing that love means merging completely, empathy means absorbing pain, and connection means erasing boundaries. But individuation, The process of becoming a whole, distinct self requires something different. It requires the ability to hold empathy without drowning in it, to feel deeply without dissolving, to extend care without abandoning the truth of one's own being. Empathy is one of humanity's most powerful capacities. It allows us to imagine the inner world of another, to resonate with their joys and sorrows, to step into their shoes and sense life from their perspective. Without empathy, relationships remain shallow, mechanical, or even cruel. Yet empathy without boundaries is not strength, it is vulnerability to chaos. When one takes on another's suffering as their own, they risk losing the capacity to discern what belongs to them and what does not. The empath becomes a sponge, absorbing emotions until they are drained, overwhelmed, or resentful. In this state, empathy becomes a burden rather than a gift. Boundaries, often misunderstood as walls, are in truth the structures that make genuine empathy possible. A boundary is not a rejection of the other, but a recognition of difference. This is me, that is you. With clear boundaries, one can listen deeply without collapsing, can care passionately without being consumed. Boundaries allow the empath to remain steady in the face of another storm, to offer support without being swept into the chaos. They protect the individuality of both parties, ensuring that care does not become control and compassion does not become self-destruction. Individuation, then, is the art of integrating empathy with boundaries. It is the capacity to feel with others while remaining rooted in one's own center. It is the recognition that true strength lies not in merging, but in connection that honors difference. A person who has individuated does not fear intimacy, but neither do they confuse it with fusion. They understand that love can flourish only when each self remains whole, when each voice retains its authenticity, when each person bears their own responsibility for their life. This integration is not achieved easily. Many people mistake sacrifice for strength, believing that to give up their needs entirely is proof of love. They silence their voices, neglect their desires, and absorb the pain of others until they collapse under its weight. Others swing to the opposite extreme, mistaking rigid independence for freedom. They build walls so thick that no empathy can pass through, no vulnerability can reach them, and no intimacy can grow. Individuation is the path between these extremes, the weaving together of openness and firmness, compassion and selfhood. Psychologically, individuation involves confronting the unconscious ties that keep us entangled in others' expectations. A person may discover that their need to rescue others comes not from pure compassion, but from a fear of abandonment. They may realize that their inability to set boundaries comes from childhood lessons that love must be earned through compliance. They may uncover anger buried beneath years of self-sacrifice or grief hidden under the mask of strength. Individuation requires bringing these patterns into awareness, disentangling the self from inherited roles, and choosing consciously how to relate. In relationships, the difference between fusion and individuation is striking. In fusion, conflict is terrifying because disagreement feels like a threat to survival. The fused couple cannot bear separation, so they suppress differences until resentment festers. In individuation, conflict is not an enemy, but a teacher. Differences can be expressed without destroying the bond, because each partner knows they are whole in themselves. In fusion, love feels like possession. In individuation, love feels like freedom. Empathy with boundaries transforms not only personal relationships, but also professional and social life. A teacher who has individuated can care deeply for students without carrying their burdens home each night. A therapist can sit with grief, rage, or despair without being shattered by it. A leader can listen to the needs of their people without becoming paralyzed by responsibility for every pain. Boundaries do not diminish compassion, they make it sustainable. Without them, empathy burns out with them. Empathy becomes a source of renewal. The journey of individuation is often accompanied by resistance, both internal and external. Internally, the psyche resists change, clinging to old patterns of sacrifice or avoidance. Externally, others may push back when boundaries are set, especially if they have grown accustomed to unlimited access to one's energy. Friends, partners, or family may accuse the individuating person of selfishness or coldness. Yet these reactions reveal the necessity of the process. To individuate is to step out of roles imposed by others and into authenticity, even if it disrupts the old balance. Culturally, individuation challenges collective norms that reward conformity. Many societies value obedience over authenticity, sacrifice over selfhood, merging over difference. To individuate is to risk disapproval, to walk a path that may not be celebrated by the collective, but is essential for the soul. It is an act of courage, for it means choosing wholeness over approval, integrity over performance, depth over comfort. Ultimately, individuation is not isolation, but connection of a higher order. The individuated person can give without resentment, love without fear, and serve without erasure of the self. They embody a paradoxy, deeply empathetic yet firmly grounded, open to others yet unwavering in their own truth. Their strength does not lie in overpowering others or dissolving into them, but in weaving together compassion and clarity, softness and solidity, self and other in a living balance that evolves across the course of a lifetime. And so, the greatest torture of all is not vengeance, but vision. A super empath doesn't destroy a narcissist. They simply stand so unshakably in their truth that the narcissist's illusions collapse around them. For the one who sees both shadow and light can never be enslaved by a mask